Early on a rainy Thursday, we took off from our current home in McKinleyville, California, for our former home in Sacramento and Son Kurtis' 45th birthday. Wife Christine was driving, and I was complaining and whining as usual. Just south of us, we passed through a wet Eureka. Our son's birthday was the following day on Cinco de Mayo. Frankly, I hated the trip. 340 miles and 6 hours of highways and byways didn't sit well with me. One may wonder why I complain. The Highway 101 trip must be one of the most beautiful in the world. Just look at these giant redwoods. I had driven the long trip to and from Humboldt County many times, but I was no longer physically allowed to drive. That's another story. Fortunately, Christine didn't mind playing chauffeur. Eventually, the trip wound down and we arrived in the state capital. The Sacramento weather was beautiful, and as I anticipated our visit with our son and family, my grumpy mood was lifted. Here we are in an old neighborhood near Watt and Folsom Boulevard. And there's our old street, Fallbrook Way. Finally, there's our house for over 30 years, where Kurtis and daughter Frederica grew up and went to schools nearby. Former neighbors Joanne and Terry Hills and the birthday boy Kurtis and Dante greeted us. Kurtis, Stephanie, and grandson Dante now live in the house we bought new 46 years ago. And yes, the mortgage is paid. We'll show Kurt and Stephanie's marvelous home improvements later. We only had a short time with them before we had to check into our hotel, the Larkspur Landing. The Larkspur Landing was a semi-posh hotel where we stayed during Kurtis and Stephanie's wedding in June 2007. But this time we had a more opulent suite, a boudoir for Christine, and also one for the old man for his sacred naps. There were 2 large TVs, a fully equipped kitchen and bathroom. After we settled in, I took my nap before we returned to Kurt and Stephanie's for dinner. Now, one of Kurt's latest additions to our former home was this smart brick planter to replace my old falling down trash can screen. Inside was this dazzling sitting room area. Kurt and Stephanie's decor featured a corrugated aluminum wall plus red and white paint and lots of interesting music-oriented knickknacks. Collectibles and art abound throughout the house. In the front room are Dante's drums, and here's Stephanie's piano, and there's the talented drummer Kurtis' full-size set. The fully equipped kitchen has an automotive motif. Praise the Lord! While Stephanie is clearing away and preparing for dinner, let's continue our tour. The range hood features even more collectibles. And note the hubcaps above the kitchen window. There's also a large aquarium next to the refrigerator. Inspiration for the automotive themes are in the garage, where Kurtis is restoring a '65 Olds convertible with the help of son Dante and father-in-law Ron Texario. Next to the garage is the family room, which they decorated with music and tattoo art posters. There's surround stereo, the TV, and a large collection of contemporary music CDs. They recently replaced all our old windows with high-tech insulated ones. Moving to the central hallway, it's beautifully painted and features many photos of Kurt, his band members, rock star autograph photos, and family portraits. Meanwhile, Kurt prepared margaritas from the strawberries Christine bought during the trip. You may have seen grandson Dante's haircut in our last video. Well, Stephanie got one too, in preparation for the birthday party the next day. Steph is a vegetarian, but Christine brought 3 steaks which Kurt expertly barbecued. I finally learned how it's done. Dinner was delicious, but facing a busy Cinco de Mayo the next day, we returned to the hotel early. Next morning, after a generous complimentary larkspur breakfast, we went shopping. Close to noon, we stopped at Rayleigh's and picked up our pre-ordered gourmet luncheon and took it to good friend Ann Weldy's for a long overdue visit. Doctors Ann Weldy and Stephen Harris are my best friends, and this was a special opportunity to see them. Both are department heads emeritus from Sac State U. Ann is a renowned novelist who encouraged and advised me in writing my own novels. She added some special yummies to the lunch, and we consumed all with wine and gusto. I took short breaks to shoot the video. Back at the Larkspur, it was time for a quick snooze and on to Kurt Hardaway's for the big birthday event. Here again is the birthday boy, Curtis P. Hardaway, born on May 5th, 1967. He's a very popular guy, and food and drinkables were laid out as many of his friends, relatives, and co-workers began to arrive. There's mother-in-law Gina, and helping out is bass player and good friend Dusty Miller. A respected surgery tech, Kurt's Sutter Surgery co-workers also came to celebrate his 45th. On hand was Kurt's father-in-law, Ron Texiero. Along with his lovely wife was Randy Neiman, a bass player from one of Kurt's earlier bands. Like Kurtis, he's still an active musician, and here they are in that band from yesterday. Dusty Miller is the bass player with a current band and also a talented actor. He helps Stephanie keep the party going. As the lively party continued, it spilled over into the patio. Josh, a longtime friend, was a groupie from one of the first bands, and he was there with his two daughters. Kevin Davis and Curtis went to the elementary school down the street. They were in kindergarten together. That was over 40 years ago. Dr. Weber, a good friend and orthopedic surgeon, showed up. He treated my shoulder impingement years ago. Kurt is one of his favorite surgery techs. And the party goes on. We left early because we were planning a trip to Merced the following morning. I'm sure going to miss those Larkspur breakfasts, but it was time to get going. Now, Merced is nearly 2 hours south of Sacramento. Not much scenery and lots of squashed bugs on the windshield to muddy up my video. Still, it was a nice day, and we made it to Phil and Vi McDaniels unscathed. Christine had brought a token gift, and Phil met us at the door. Phil growled when he saw I had the video camera. He hadn't seen them for several years, but we'd been in frequent contact. Vi was in her mid-80s and had just suffered some health issues. Today we were glad to see her looking so well. They took us to lunch, and while they talked, I videoed. Our history with the McDaniels goes back 46 years, when we both bought homes across from one another on Fallbrook Way, where Curtis lives. A few years later, they moved up into the mountains to Kybers on Highway 50, next to the American River. Phil was in charge of security for the holiday cabins, and we bought one and saw them often. They moved around California several times, and even debated moving up to Humboldt near us. Our visit was far too short, but we returned to Sacramento and stopped at Trader Joe's to pick up some necessities. Too bad there isn't a Joe's in Humboldt County. We spent one last night at the Larkspur, checked out, and took off for home around 6:30 a.m. Of course, it's just a repeat in reverse of our 6-hour trip down. And we passed Marine World on our way through Vallejo. Along the way, there were even more vineyards than before. Like France, California is one of the world's wine capitals. We made good time, but had to slow down through Willits, one of the state's speed traps. I got a ticket on one of my trips through there. There were pauses at the convenient California rest stops. Ultimately, we began to see some familiar Northern California scenery. And once again, it was a must on my list to shoot the redwoods. We finished up the long trip at our home in McKinleyville. The trip had been great, but there's no place like home.